Pleasure to introduce Dr. Kate Barger Weathers. Dr. Barger Weathers is the Director of World Animal Welfare at Cobb-Vantress, which is a global primary breeder company. She leads the company's global animal welfare program and actively collaborates to enhance animal care, improve bird health and welfare outcomes, and to increase poultry welfare understanding. In addition, she serves on animal welfare advisory boards for several poultry companies in the US, the Chicken Sustainability Council for a global food company, the board of directors of the International Poultry Welfare Alliance, and she is the poultry veterinary delegate for the AVMA House of Delegates and the AVMA Animal Welfare Committee. Dr. Barger Weathers completed her undergraduate degrees and veterinary degree at NC State University. And today she'll be speaking about industry advances in meat bird welfare, a growing focus on animal welfare in the supply chain. And Dr. Barger Weathers pre-recorded her talk because of some potential technological issues related to the internet. So we'll be watching her presentation, but she is here, as you just saw, so she can answer any questions you may have after the talk is finished. So make sure to post all the questions you have for Dr. Barger Weathers in the Q&A. And if you intend to leave her talk, please feel free and please fill out the survey so that we can build our next event appropriately. So, all right, let's get started with Dr. Barger Weathers' presentation.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you for your patience and apologies for the sound. But again, it's really a pleasure to be part of this webinar today. And I thank the organizers of the Poultry Extension Collaborative for this opportunity. I was asked specifically to speak about broiler welfare assessment. And so in today's talk, I'm going to talk about the evolution of broiler welfare in North America, specifically in the United States, and also why this is a growing area of focus and interest for the supply chain, not only broiler companies and the broiler industry, but also those customers that we provide in retail, food service, and restaurants. So in this talk, I'm going to, again, talk about the evolution of changes that have occurred. I'm going to go back only about 20 years. Certainly welfare has been a focus for a very long time, but in the interest of time for this presentation, I'm really going to focus just on the past 20 years until present day, and then also talk a bit about the future of broiler welfare from the perspective of standards and the challenges that come with auditing welfare criteria and scoring and assessing welfare in a practical location like the farm, hatchery, or processing plant. I will also speak a little bit about the traditional assessments that are done, briefly mention some of the newer methods for assessment that have happened, particularly in the last year with COVID, and also focus on innovation on the horizon and why this may be critically important for broiler welfare assessment and understanding and how and what and where this may be applied throughout the industry. And then, as you all heard with the recording, I'm going to talk about what I call the bumps along the way. Those are both regulatory and external stakeholder pressures, moments of sunshine, and those are really some newer collaborative efforts to improve communication, research, and welfare improvement. And then what I view as truly the pathway for success, and that is a combination of welfare with sustainability for the future of the supply chain globally. I'll emphasize some pivotal moments throughout my talk that hopefully will highlight why change has occurred and why perhaps it will continue to occur in the future. So let's start by looking at the past. So if we think back to broiler production in the US and globally, about 20 or so years ago, welfare parameters at that time were predominantly related to broiler production expectations. So there were things, for example, looking at overall mortality level, culling percentage, the incidence of disease, and what the industry commonly calls FLAWs, which are feed, light, and litter, air quality, water, sanitation, and space standards and provisions. So at that time, most companies had a program that was adjusted according to the recommendations from the breeder company, as well as to the company requirements and the bird needs. Observations were very basic at that time in the industry, and at the broiler farm level. Farmers would always look to see birds doing these 5 behaviors: eating, drinking, resting, playing, or expressing normal behavior, as well as talking and expressing normal levels and types of sounds. Humane handling has been a focus, continues to be a focus. At that time, there were not as many specific requirements, and there wasn't as much training 2 to 3 decades ago, specifically on humane handling. And there were also very few dedicated staff members solely focusing on poultry welfare, both within the broiler industry and within the supply chain. Those that were focused on broiler welfare at that time were also wore other hats, for example, quality assurance, a veterinary role, or perhaps a production role. And so the emphasis at this point in the industry and certainly in broiler research was mainly on daily care and how to improve overall health and performance. But as I'm going to show you in the next few slides, there's several factors that happened, and this resulted in specific criteria, frequency of audits, and standardization of assessments to improve broiler welfare understanding and broiler welfare focus. So the first transition, or bump as I call it, occurred around the year 2000. At that time, there was a lot going on in industry, primarily with the increase in automatic equipment, for example, controllers that you can see here, that allowed farmers to provide better round-the-clock conditions and care for their chickens. So instead of having a farmer having to turn on or off the lights, the controller could do it automatically. Instead of having somebody roll up or roll down the curtains according to the prevalent winds and the needs for ventilation, this equipment could be set with specific temperature zones and fans to allow inlets to open to allow fans to kick on, so that the environment could be precisely provided for the bird's needs in accordance with the bird's age to optimize welfare outcomes throughout the life of the flock. There was also an increase starting at about this time within society, particularly in North America and Europe, and that was really centered around how food is produced. Some of this initial pressure originated from NGOs and animal advocacy groups, but at least here in the United States, a lot of this evolution on welfare occurred within the supply chain. I reached out to a professor who's now retired, who was involved with an advisory committee at this time, and he said that over 95% of the retail chains and restaurant chains in the US were represented by 2 major organizations. And those 2 groups came together and basically said to the broiler industry, we need to have some guidelines, we need to have some set standards to ensure welfare and to make measurable progress. So that focus on broiler welfare urged the industry, and specifically the National Chicken Council, to create animal welfare guidelines. And those were created in 1999 and allowed the industry to move forward. At the same time, we saw really moving towards the year 2010 with some new labeling claims and animal welfare stipulations where the messaging was really directed towards the consumer. And that in some cases created more confusion, but it also allowed for differentiation of those guidelines and of those standards that were originally created around the year 2000. So during the 10 years that followed the original guidelines that were released between 1999 and 2001, we saw that there was a lot of focus on which standards should be used. Is there a scientific basis? Should we look at resource-based or outcome-based measurements? Who is going to do the auditing? Who will report those results, and what will we do with those? In general, the broiler industry all agreed upon the philosophy of trust but verify for conducting animal welfare audits to ensure transparency, to measure improvements, and to confirm corrective actions. However, the divergence of standards that occurred and the scientific validity or individual requirements from some specific food supply companies created some challenges for auditing. And so I'll highlight a few of those challenges later in this presentation, and also highlight some standards and how they focus on outcome-based measurements, while others include criteria for resource-based or input-based factors. And so what we've seen now, and I'll highlight this moving forward, is that there's a point of differentiation. There's certainly consumer perception factor, in what is on a label when you purchase chicken in the store, but there's also a point of differentiation between the different welfare guidelines and welfare audits. As compared to the swine industry, at least in the US, where there's a common swine industry audit and everybody uses the same parameters, poultry has been a storied tale of many different pathways, and we continue to see that, and I think we'll continue to see that moving forward. So all of this movement really created some different standards and criteria to benchmark welfare progress. And this is what I'm calling here as junction number 1 in this animal welfare pathway for the timeline of poultry welfare evolution within the past 20 years. So if we think about poultry being in the center, as you see here, both a broiler and breeder, this is truly what we should be focused on, is the welfare and making improvements to the health and well-being of these chickens. However, there are a lot of voices around this proverbial table. So we know that companies, both broiler and breeder companies, as well as the broiler industry, has a voice at the table, since they're the ones taking care of the birds on a daily basis, and they have a vested interest in doing the right thing and making forward progress in the area of broiler welfare. We also see a lot of restaurants and retailers that have a vested interest in welfare, since they are the group at the table that provides clarity and transparency to the consumer about food production and food origin. In some countries, we see governments are quite active, particularly in the EU, where they have many welfare regulations related to slaughter, transport, and on-farm production standards. Though OIE is a great example, they've developed a chapter on broiler welfare and now recently a chapter on layer welfare. And those two guidelines are commonly used as a baseline for many other governments in their national broiler welfare guidelines around the world. Finally, the NGOs and the animal advocacy groups also have an interest in welfare, and specifically for this talk, in broiler welfare improvements. Everybody has their own opinion and their own perspective, and a lot of time the question that comes up is, well, whose perspective matters? Whose standards should we use? How do these different groups define broiler welfare? How do they even define animal welfare? I think it's fair to say that everybody agrees in this statement that the animal should have a life worth living and it was treated humanely. However, the perspectives and the expectations for welfare standards and really the future of animal welfare is where we come to this junction in the pathway and figure out how to move forward. So some examples of this divergence in perspective and focus from the various groups can be seen here. As you can see here in the top left where it says 2000, 2001, around this era, there were some NGOs that were very focused on what they perceived to be cruelty in the industry, particularly with regards to slaughter methods, animal handling, and basic welfare. NCC, again, in response to the pressure from the supply chain and perhaps in response to pressure from the NGOs, developed the first national guidelines for broiler welfare in 1999, as you can see here in the blue box. A few years later, they developed the first national audit criterion and audit tool that has changed and continues to be updated about every 1 to 2 years, that is used to audit broiler welfare throughout the country. USDA also stepped into the mix with a process verified program, and this allows for companies to have additional government oversight specifically for welfare programs and the implementation of those welfare programs. Based on the need to have quality, trained, and competent auditors, PACO, or the Professional Animal Auditor Certification Organization, for which you see the logo there, was developed and trains hundreds of poultry welfare auditors each year from different parts of the world. Robust welfare programs were created within broiler companies and even within the food supply chain. Today, there are many food supply companies that have more dedicated personnel like me in roles specifically for animal welfare that are focused on developing and managing welfare programs and do that as a full-time job. Externally, there were other groups that began to report on their perception of welfare progress and welfare reporting within the supply chain, and we now see that as an annual scorecard, if you will, and ranking for those welfare improvements. And so in this era, I think it's safe to say that there were a new set of label and marketing claims that were related to broiler production. There were a lot of different stakeholders around the proverbial table, so to speak, that were interested in welfare and interested in driving welfare forward. But some of these have actually improved welfare and the outcome for broilers in the fact that they are being raised in quality, humane and appropriate conditions. However, some of these have resulted in challenges in communication and building trust from farm to fork. We know that that has occurred, and I really don't think it's going to go away. But there's no doubt in my mind that we are in a better place now than we were when I started my career in the industry nearly 20 years ago. So moving forward from 2010 to present day, the supply chain has really been focused on accountability for welfare and measurable welfare improvements. Dr. Temple Grandin, who I've had the pleasure of working with and who's pictured here, is a well-known speaker and author in welfare, and she has stated many times that you manage what you measure. In other words, for the industry and for stakeholders within the supply chain, if we're not measuring and evaluating aspects of our internal operations or of our external suppliers, how can we make improvements and how can we actually prove that we are improving over time? So in this part of my talk, I want to emphasize the 3 M's, which are monitoring, measuring, and managing welfare results. These 3 components are the cornerstone for most welfare standards used today, not only in the US, but around the world. They are also part of the criteria and the audits that are used, and not only within broiler welfare, but also within other poultry and animal agriculture welfare standards and audits. They can be easily implemented with minimal technology and minimal additional resources. And they are also used not only for external third-party audits, but they are also used for internal auditing by many companies. So for monitoring specifically, this is really about factors that can be assessed on a daily basis by the caretaker, by the equipment used at the facility, and by those auditors, whether they be internal or external auditors. However, what is monitored can depend on the age of the bird, the type of facility, for example, whether it's a processing plant or a farm, and what the actual welfare standard or welfare program requires. Today, using the philosophy that I mentioned previously of trust but verify, most companies monitor various welfare-related factors on a daily basis with their expectations for their farmers and employees, and then they also are additionally monitoring on a weekly or monthly or quarterly basis with their internal auditor teams. So if we now look at measuring, there are some established criteria, which I will showcase a little bit later, and methods that are commonly used to assess different components of broiler welfare. The challenge with measuring welfare today is that there's usually a specific number of birds and items that must be measured. And when these items are measured, it's usually a point in time. The objectivity or the ability to objectively measure these factors is often in question, and there's often a challenge of representing a fair sample of that facility or that flock when we're talking about an enormous complex of 1 million plus birds, or when we're talking about a barn that may have 25 to 30,000 broilers contained within the 4 walls. When we talk about managing results, this is really a critical part of welfare programs for assessing welfare. When we think about monitoring and measuring items, it's very important to be able to take corrective actions if needed, and to consider the proactive steps to continue to improve objectiveness of that welfare program. So again, many poultry companies use their welfare assessments and their internal auditors to compare results within their enterprises. For example, looking at one farm versus another within a complex, or looking at one broiler complex versus another. Some even look at some standards, for example, with mortality, how they're doing versus their competition. And for the supply chain that is buying the poultry meat from their suppliers, many of those progressive food companies are using the results from their welfare assessments to compare present versus prior results, and also to evaluate how their different suppliers are doing within a region. Although welfare assessment outcomes are not part of standard industry-wide reporting efforts like AgriStats, I strongly believe that there is emphasis on welfare, and the push to improve welfare within the supply chain is present and will continue to be supported by senior company leadership, both within the production companies as well as within the food companies, and that will certainly extend to all who work with live animals. So as I mentioned previously, what is monitored for welfare and how these criteria are measured is a challenge for the global poultry industry using assessment tools that we currently have at our disposal. Common items that can be seen on most welfare audits include bird-based or outcome-based measures that really look at how that animal responds to the system. There are also protocol-based measurements in which we are evaluating SOPs and the implementation of the systems to achieve the desired outcomes. And there are also facility-based measurements that focus on specific inputs for the care and the provision of basic essentials for the flock. These items can all be monitored and measured during observations, during in-person visits and audits. They can also be conducted via review of records and often interviews with those responsible for the different criteria. I mentioned that during this crazy year of COVID that we've seen some changes, and some of that can be seen in how these different measurements have been assessed. So we've gone from in-person audits that were very, very common pre-COVID and during COVID, when we saw a lot of restrictions for travel and facility entry. We saw a lot of the industry and the supply chain pivot to virtual audits. This still involved records reviews. It still involved observations via video and photos. And it even still involved interviews of personnel involved with live animal production procedures and management. So it's really interesting during the last year to see how the industry and how the supply chain has maintained the emphasis on using certified auditors to conduct poultry welfare assessments so that they can be objective in their measurements, but also they can continue even when travel and on-site visits are not always possible. So for those of you that are not familiar with broiler welfare auditing, I thought I would just include a few pictures here to give you an example of what is commonly used on a weekly basis, or certainly for the annual or semi-annual third-party audits that are conducted commonly within the industry. As I mentioned previously, most items involved in broiler welfare audits and the criteria are measured via traditional methods. So whether that's a review of records or in-person observation and evaluations. These items are typically measured at hatcheries, farms, during transportation at the processing plant within the broiler company or complex. The majority of broiler companies have internal auditors who are using the same criteria that are used by the external auditors. However, they're using those criteria to monitor and conduct routine internal audits on a weekly, monthly, or quarterly basis. The external independent auditors who use the criteria are hired to conduct third-party audits. That's usually part of the supply chain contract. And they would conduct those in accordance with the supply chain expectations. Apart from the review of documents for training and corporate commitment, audits will typically start at the hatchery and are related to chick quality, injury rate in the hatchery, euthanasia and culling practices, and management of the environment to optimize both chick safety and chick comfort. Auditors then typically visit various farms, including one that is within 7 days of catching, to verify litter quality, air quality, provision of feed, water, and a safe environment, stocking density, gate scoring, and general bird care, including euthanasia and culling. One farm is also included in external audits, specifically to allow the auditor to evaluate broiler catching and transport of those birds to the processing plant. At the processing plant, end-of-life welfare criteria like foot pad quality, bruising, bird handling, and the efficacy of slaughter procedures are also measured. So as I mentioned previously, the focus on internal audits within the company and also from external audits from the supply chain are common and are actually a welcome part of businesses these days. The criteria shown here are typically used to ensure standardization of assessments and scoring. The dedicated employees in animal welfare from both the broiler companies and the food companies are managing the welfare data that's collected and analyzing outcomes to ensure that there's continuous improvement. I honestly believe that we should all be enthusiastic about the synergy between welfare, quality assurance, and production teams, and the engagement that the broiler industry has today with the supply chain partners. There's no doubt that this will continue to progress and to be a positive movement forward in the pathway for welfare improvement, as senior leaders, both in production companies and food companies, place emphasis on poultry welfare as part of their operational expectations and strategic goals. However, there are some challenges, and here I want to focus on the fact that we do have outcome-based measurements and we can manage programs to make progress, but there's also a lot of frustration within the industry right now about the variance in standards and how some criteria may or may not be based on science and common expectations for measuring welfare criteria. I'm not going to name any specific welfare audit tools or guidelines here, but it's important for you to know that there are some both industry and externally based, as well as food companies have their own welfare audits. Most of those welfare programs have a common foundation from the original NCC guidelines that were developed over 20 years ago, but there has been a divergence in the variety of items that are now verified, how to assess the criteria, and how to score the items on the welfare audits. So in this slide and in the next slide, I want to highlight this variance and the challenges for assessing welfare using today's tools that we have. For example, for gate scoring of broilers that are on the farm, each of these standards shown here requires about 100 broilers to be assessed. Both use a 3-point system, as you can see mentioned here, with a score 0, a score 1, or score 2. And while they have slightly different explanations, the overall perspective of broiler mobility is similar for the person conducting the audit. However, the scoring is where we have divergence. One standard only counts the number of gate score 2 birds, and that score is then reported and the number is allocated in the audit based on a sliding scale. The other standard mentioned here requires the auditor to tally the number of broilers in each gate score category, and then the auditor has to conduct a mathematical equation to achieve the final score, and then can determine if the flock passes or fails the gate scoring. In this example of a facility-based criteria, I want to highlight the lighting program and how lighting intensity is also a challenge in broiler welfare audits. So while there's a common expectation that there must be sufficient light provided to birds to allow them to eat and drink and to move normally, and for the farmer to assess bird behavior and health during each walkthrough on each day during the life of those birds on the farm, the actual number of hours of light versus darkness in a program for growing birds is quite variable. And even more variable is the level of light that the standard dictates. So as you can see here, there's some differences in the minimum number of dark hours, and there's also quite a divergence in the minimum light level that has to be provided for those broilers here in North America. In Europe, on the other hand, there is a EU standard for lighting level that is used, but we're also seeing some divergence there with specific welfare standards that also want a higher lighting intensity. There are other input related criteria like stocking density, the use of enrichments, the source of lighting, the nutrition and health programs that can be utilized for broilers on farms, and even the breed that can be used are commonly debated by those creating broiler welfare standards, those who have to manage the broilers on the farm, and those who have to audit the criteria. Currently, there's not a solid single answer for what is best for the bird and what is best for sustainable agriculture production around the world. And thus the variability in standards that I've mentioned and highlighted here, as well as what is monitored and what is measured and how these items can be managed, is a dilemma and a challenge for the supply chain. So this brings me to junction number 2 in the welfare pathway in today's presentation. I think we all have the same goals of ensuring that the animal had a life worth living and was treated humanely. I don't think that has changed. However, as welfare programs have evolved, the question is still, whose standards should be used? And when there is a change, what is the reason for that change? If there is a change related to new scientific understanding, what is that? And if it's truly going to improve welfare, why haven't all standards changed to reflect that new innovation or that new thinking? For criteria that is changed, a question that often comes up is anyone tracking data to verify that a measurable improvement has been made in welfare? And if there have been any other unintended consequences and impacts with regards to sustainability, consumer choice, flock health, the cost of production, the environmental health and safety factors for those working in live production, and of course, for the actual outcome-based measurement for the chickens who are in the middle of the equation. Currently, there's a huge bump in the pathway facing the North American and the European broiler producers and supply chains based in these countries. This bump that I'm referring to is known as the Better Chicken Commitment, or the BCC. This is a campaign that's being driven by many different animal advocacy and NGO groups that started several years ago and aims to achieve supply chain commitment and follow through by 2024 or 2026. The BCC has specific expectations for lower stocking density, for increased lighting, the use of enrichments, controlled atmosphere slaughter method, third-party welfare auditing, and the use of certified higher welfare breeds. However, again, the questions arise. How is welfare and specifically higher welfare defined? What is the reason for the change, and what impact will all of this have on broiler production and welfare outcomes, and what science supports these specific changes? Honestly, don't have the time or the interest to dive into these possible reasons for these questions today. They may come up in the chat, and I certainly welcome the discussion if they do. However, in this talk, I think it's important to recognize that this proverbial bump in the animal welfare pathway for the future of broiler production is present. And we also need to recognize that some of these same groups have issued various reports seen here on the bottom left of this screen to help emphasize their point of view and perhaps their BCC demands. Without a doubt, this pressure is causing a lot of chaos and confusion for many stakeholders within the supply chain. However, from this slide forward, I really want to focus on possible steps forward in a more positive direction for the broiler industry and the future of meat poultry welfare for the supply chain. Two examples of what I call the sunshine moments along the welfare pathway are these positive steps that are highlighted in other locations on the slide. First, in the bottom right, you can see this announcement from FFAR in which over $4 million were contributed as part of the Smart Broiler Initiative. This fantastic example of a supply chain working together, specifically McDonald's, partnering with FFAR and worldwide researchers, as well as some of the largest broiler supply companies in the world, are looking at evaluating real-world solutions to better assess broiler welfare in the future. The intended outcome of this multi-year project is going to be a positive pathway forward. And I honestly hope and believe that technology will come out of this Smart Broiler Initiative that will help provide consistent, timely, objective, and accurate welfare assessments at the farm level. The other initiative to highlight is a global coalition of stakeholders focused on poultry welfare and sustainable poultry production practices. I've had the honor of being part of the International Poultry Welfare Alliance, or IPWA, as well as the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Poultry and Eggs. Both are relatively new organizations that include the companies and stakeholders shown here, as well as different researchers from around the world. Both groups seek to enhance communication, scientific knowledge, and outcomes in both welfare and sustainability that will benefit the global supply chain. Rather than simply focusing on perceived problems and the bumps in the road, I'd now like to share some positive thoughts with you about the future of poultry welfare. Although I'm not a New York Yankees fan, I do enjoy sports, and I thought this quote would be a good one to share from the legendary Yogi Berra. As we focus on the future for the remainder of my talk, Yogi's words are particularly impactful and important since he said it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. So I can't predict the future, but I sincerely hope that the future will involve advanced technology, partnerships in research, and innovative thinking that will allow us to make substantial and meaningful progress. From my perspective, the industry and the supply chain needs technology that will improve the accuracy, objectiveness, and scope of measurements to assess broiler welfare. These measurements and this technology needs to be applicable in real-world settings where we deal with dust, feathers, humidity, and sanitation procedures. And we will continue to grow birds in an environment that is challenging to assess all the birds in the flock, but we really need to think about how to assess welfare over the life of that flock, not just a snapshot of one day during an audit like we do now. I also hope that the future will allow the supply chain to optimize the focus and the efficiency of people. Today, when we are training our farmers' employees to better observe and understand flock behavior, I hope that we will have a future that will enhance the time and the ability of these individuals to focus on behavioral observations during their time in the chicken house. I also hope that monitoring and measuring welfare over the life of the flock will enable veterinarians, farmers, and production managers to quickly make corrective actions if they have timely results and early insight into the behavior, condition, and health of the flock. Finally, I hope that research and innovative tools will enhance the synergy of welfare science, biological productivity and efficiency of poultry, as well as practical husbandry and management capacities in real-world settings. Some of the things that I will talk about in the next few slides are obviously going to be considered in developed countries. We also have to think about welfare from a worldwide basis in both developed and developing countries. And so while I've mentioned the challenges with welfare standards and criteria in previous slides, I hope that future knowledge will help us develop measures and standards that will emphasize what the birds need and prefer. And rather than focusing on our human perspective and bias, perhaps the science will enable us to better understand what the birds want. Finally, when we think about welfare, we have to think about welfare as part of sustainability. We can't view welfare as a standalone factor in research, in the introduction of innovative equipment, or in the development of standards or technology. If welfare is part of that strategic plan and direction to enhance sustainable solutions around the world, I believe this will be a positive pathway forward that is needed and desired by the global supply chain. So in these next few slides, I'm going to focus on some technology that's being tested on commercial farms, some that's being tested at the university or research level, and some that's actually starting to be implemented in different parts of developed countries. So in this example, the introduction and implementation of technology that can evaluate the sounds inside a chicken house, I think will result in improved welfare understanding and improved welfare outcomes. For example, by viewing what sounds the flock is emitting and when the bird sounds increase, the farmer can begin to investigate what is happening inside the house and within the environment that is resulting in the flock being restless. For typical broiler farms, you remember we talked about the dark period that may range from 4 to 6 or 8 hours. And during this period when the lights are out, the birds typically rest and are quite quiet. In this example of using sound to more accurately understand bird behavior and bird comfort, the dark blue blocks that you see here on the left occur from midnight to approximately 6 a.m. And this correlates to the time when the birds are quiet and sleeping since the lights are out. However, in this particular illustration, in approximately 30 to 33 days of the grow-up period, you can see the color blocks are a lighter color during this same dark period. This indicates the birds were more active, made more noise or vocalizations, and perhaps were a bit more stressed during the nighttime hours. Upon investigation, the farmer discovered that there was a squeaking fan that needed maintenance repairs. So although the farmer was not present in the house 24 hours a day, this type of technology can help explain the type of environment the bird prefers and wants, and when that environment is not ideal. Similar technology may allow for the detection of coughing or snicking sounds so that a veterinarian can respond more proactively to a flock that may be experiencing early stages of a respiratory illness. The next step that I hope will be part of our future are robotics. Self-driving robots are already used in other industries, and there's great interest in the possibility of this technology for poultry farms and hatcheries. As mentioned earlier, if we want to prioritize the knowledge and efficiency of our farm staff, robotics may be able to help with this in the future. If robots can identify floor eggs, mortality, and non-mobile poultry within a flock, and can even monitor air quality and litter quality congestions throughout the day, the farmer could more proactively respond to a situation and would also have more time to focus on observations of poultry behavior and also repairing equipment when needed. In this example, you'll see different photos that represent the introduction and perhaps the implementation of equipment to better understand bird behavior, mobility, and preference. And these could all be game changers for the poultry welfare assessment process, as well as for poultry welfare understanding throughout the supply chain. For example, instead of mandating the light intensity must be provided, perhaps our focus in the future should be on the light intensity that broilers prefer when they are eating and drinking, as shown here in the picture on the top right, in which we have bright lights over the feeders and near the drinkers, versus where birds want to rest and dust bathe and show natural behaviors, and you can see in the middle where there's a dimmer light. If our goals are to increase natural behavior in the future within our broiler flocks, I believe it's important to evaluate what type of enrichments poultry prefer, how and when they will use these enrichments, and what welfare benefits these may provide for the life of the flock. Currently, poultry feed and drinker equipment has been designed to optimize efficiency, to reduce wastage and contamination, and to encourage regular eating and drinking in broiler flocks. However, I hope that future research and innovative technology will focus on what is best for bird needs and biological preferences, while also improving the quality of life and the health of the flock. So there are many companies that are evaluating things like infrared technology, camera technology from a bird's eye view mounted on the ceiling or the wall of the houses, or even technology like optical flow that will help us better understand flock distribution, activity, and movement within the barn. There are other companies that are starting to evaluate wearable technology for chickens and floor-based equipment that can evaluate bird movement, gait, and activity. While I am certainly excited about this with my welfare and veterinary hat on, as well as working for a breeding company, I really hope that the future will do more than just highlight how and when chickens move. I hope that it will enable us as scientists, as veterinarians, and as production experts, as well as welfare scientists, to understand the biological changes of the chicken as it grows and develops, and also the intersection of health, nutrition, welfare, and behavior, so that we can continue to have healthy and productive broiler chickens with good welfare and care during all stages of their lives. In this example, I hope that future research and innovative technology and equipment will enable the poultry industry to be more accurate at the processing plant and to increase the sampling that is conducted in an efficient and an effective manner. For example, instead of conducting foot pad evaluations by scoring 200 feet as we do now, there is technology that's being developed and even used in some countries that allows for all feet to be evaluated and scored using optical tools. Instead of sampling 100 birds during a visit to the processing plant for an external audit, this technology would allow for thousands of birds to be evaluated on a daily basis and would provide more transparency, welfare outcomes for the entire flock. I believe that welfare assessments end at the time that poultry are slaughtered. I know that there is some truth to this since the animal is no longer living past the slaughter point. However, I think there are items that we can assess in the slaughter plant that we can use to add value to our overall perspective and understanding of broiler welfare and the various inputs that we use at the farm level. For example, we have to remember that the end product that we want to optimize is what is served to the consumer. And while the population of the United States has a strong preference for breast meat, we have to consider the whole carcass and think about how we can optimize the quality of the meat as we use it internally in this country or we export it, and also think about how to optimize welfare and sustainability for all broilers that we produce and all meat that is consumed. So for example, research that can focus on the innovation of nutrition, stunning method, and the health of the flock can positively impact welfare and meat quality outcomes, and even food safety for the supply chain. In the past year, the industry has experienced tremendous challenges when slaughter plants close due to COVID concerns. In the future, if we have innovative equipment and research that can allow us to slaughter and to operate slaughter plants with less people in the processing plant, this would certainly be a game changer for flock health and welfare, as well as for human health and welfare. Also, if we have equipment and technology that would allow flexibility in bird size, this could also result in tremendous opportunities for improved efficiency and improvements in sustainability in the future. On this slide, I've included 3 photos of broiler production from different parts of the world. In all of these, farmers can achieve excellent animal welfare results and good flock performance. However, while there are differences in the source of light and the density that is used and what is actually included in the environment for the broilers, there are also differences present in each of these examples of the interaction of the people with the broilers, the type and the source of inputs that are needed for each flock, and biosecurity and health outcomes that have to be considered for each location. I believe that choice is important for the consumer, and I also think that choice is important when we think about global broiler production. I think it's important that we continue to talk about all of these options and that they can produce quality meat offerings as well as quality welfare outcomes. However, I'm also a realist, and I know that the poultry industry has a lot of responsibility in providing safe, affordable meat to many, many people around the world in future years. And I also know that the investment that farmers are making in houses is a 20 or 30-year timeline. So in the future, I hope that we'll continue to see innovation in the style and the design of poultry houses that truly reflect innovative thinking and optimal welfare, health, environmental, and economic aspects for the poultry industry. Given the long-term investment and cost of construction of broiler houses, it's critical to have a design that can enhance energy and water conservation on the farm, can create an environment that is pleasant, efficient, and safe for the people working within the barn, and also considers the footprint, both from an impact of the land, air, and water resources perspective. And also, I think we have to consider if the farm is close to other facilities. As we watch the discussions in Europe and other regions with regards to restriction on the duration of live animal transport, we have to think about a future where broilers may need to be hatched, grown, and slaughtered within a closed geographic area to meet regulatory standards in specific countries. In this slide, as we think towards the future, I want you to think on the egg and truly what we're doing outside of the shell or thinking outside of the chick box. Historically, there's been a focus to get the chicks out to the farm as efficiently as possible to allow them to start eating and drinking very quickly. This emphasis is not going to change. However, the use of new technology and innovative equipment is changing how the industry thinks about early feed and water access. For example, chicks in some hatcheries have access to feed and water as soon as they hatch in the hatcher cabinets. Some of these chicks may actually stay in the specialized cabinets within the hatchery for the next 48 to 72 hours with food and water access, so they continue to have optimal ventilation and air quality conditions and temperature before being placed at the farm. Other companies are developing technology to allow the chicks to hatch on the farm so that live animal transportation is essentially zero at this early point in the life of the bird, and broiler chicks have access to feed and water as well as more space immediately upon hatching. Instead of heating the entire house or brooding area, since that first week of heating is approximately 50% of the energy cost for the life of the flock, some companies are evaluating new ways of providing energy efficient brood chambers. The quality and sanitation of hatching eggs and equipment are closely linked to the quality and health of newly hatched chicks. In a future where we may be limited in what we can use for hatchery sanitation and how and when we can apply some of those products, innovative thinking will help us reevaluate how sanitation measures impact both flock health and early feed and water access or needs of neonatal chicks. Many researchers, even various broiler company experts, believe that welfare outcomes for the flock can be correlated with hatchery conditions, with incubation parameters, handling, and with transport. So if the future enables us to collectively optimize all of these areas while also enhancing chick livability, flock uniformity, and efficiency and sustainability impacts, this scenario would certainly be a win-win for everybody involved in the supply chain. In summary, welfare is complicated. Sometimes it feels like we are the blind men in this cartoon and everyone is focused on their little corner and their area of interest. And we forget to take into account the bigger picture and literally the elephant in the room when we are thinking about the perspective for broiler welfare. Science, emotion, and balancing expectations with cost, sustainability, and practical implementation have to be considered when we are thinking about welfare standards, programs, and future research. The perception and the expectation can vary depending on the background and the priorities of the person or group. However, I believe and I hope that collaborative efforts and innovation will be a positive way forward for broiler welfare, as well as for poultry welfare in general. While there are some commonalities for welfare, I believe that a committed focus on what the birds want and prefer and need should be part of our common goal. Setting arbitrary criteria for global production systems will likely not improve welfare in all areas, but can very definitely result in negative consequences for the environment, food availability and food cost, and the overall efficiency and sustainability of the broiler supply chain. Welfare and sustainability must be considered together as part of the solution and the strategy. Thank you so much for your time and for listening to my presentation. I hope that you enjoyed it and found it to be of interest. I and many others in the poultry industry, the supply chain, and the veterinary community view animal welfare as a journey and not simply as a destination. It's incredibly exciting to see how much has changed and improved in the last 20 years, and I'm really excited about what the future holds for poultry and for broiler welfare. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Barger Weathers. Very interesting, and I like to see how there's already a sort of an overarching theme where technology is used in research and in the industry, as we saw in Dr. Toscano's talk. There are some questions from the audience. The first question is about gas emissions in the house. Are there any gases measured as part of an animal welfare audit or assessment? And is hydrogen sulfide one of those? And do you deem that one important?
That is a very interesting question, so thank you for that. Commonly for broiler welfare audits around the world, including those in North America, the most common gas that is measured is ammonia. So in most countries, 25 parts per million is the standard. In other countries, 20 parts per million may be measured. We are starting to see, in addition to the gas monitors that are commonly used or the strips that would be used during welfare audits, we're starting to see technology being implemented in houses where that can be measured throughout the day and throughout the life of the flock. So I think that's a huge step forward. We're also seeing a lot of interest on CO2 monitoring. We know that levels below 3,000 parts per million for CO2 is very critical for broiler health and welfare. And so we're starting to see that now. I can't speak to other gases. I know that there's a lot of research being conducted from the environmental health and safety aspects, looking at literally what's going out of the fans from broiler houses on both dust and emissions, and also what is in litter. And I think that research and the amendments that we can make in the environment will certainly improve broiler welfare in the future.
Nice. And then there's another question, again, related to gas emissions, but more specifically for ammonia. Morgan asks or says, it's well known that high ammonia levels within the barn can lead to respiratory diseases within the flocks. During audits, do they measure ammonia levels? Is there a maximum? Maybe an additional question from me related to that is, what is done then to control if the levels are too high?
So very good question. So just to sort of provide some of the basics. So for ammonia specifically, it doesn't cause respiratory diseases. However, it certainly can impact the eye and the cilia and the trachea. So at higher levels, that's where we start to see that biological function impairment for the bird. And so that's where, if you do have a virus or bacteria that can cause a respiratory challenge for the bird, that's where we start to see those as a sequela. From an auditing standpoint, we measure ammonia at bird level. So it's typically about the height of the bird. So when you're walking through the house as an internal auditor or as an external auditor, if you're using an electronic device, typically you would clip that to the top of your boot as you're walking through the house. And so you would be monitoring throughout the 500 feet or the 120 meters of that house as you're walking throughout. And you can set it with alarms. So it will alarm if it reaches that certain critical control point. Now, apart from that, there are other very, very simple ways, perhaps not as objective, but you can use like a strip of paper that has a color changing ability and will show you if those levels are above 50 parts per million or above 100 parts per million, which is of course way, way higher than we would ever want to achieve in a broiler house. So that is currently being used by broiler companies on a regular basis. It's part of almost all welfare audits that I've ever seen, and I think it will continue to be part of that in the future. I think, as I mentioned previously, the technology that's going to allow us to monitor over time, so where you could go to a controller and you can see the daily average of ammonia, I think that's a technology that we will start to see in the future. And I think we will also see the ability to connect those sensors with ventilation systems so that the ventilation can be increased to exhaust those fumes from the house. So ammonia is produced by the moisture in the litter. It's a challenge between the moisture that's in the environment, the moisture from the drinkers, as well as the moisture that the birds are actually producing and their fecal content. So the more that we can do to have drier litter improves welfare outcomes for the birds with regards to foot and hot condition, but also certainly from an ammonia standpoint. So I think that technology will allow farmers to be more proactive in the future and to truly manage those houses, as well as to monitor and measure ammonia in a very proactive way.
Thank you. Another very current question, I would say, from the audience is, what was the most challenging or is the most challenging aspect of animal welfare auditing you've experienced now with the COVID situation? And are you conducting welfare audits online?
Great question. So for our internal audits, we continue to do those in person. So that did not stop. We did have some facilities that, just due to health concerns, we sort of passed the baton and we did some other types of internal auditing, but from an external audit, we have done those virtual. I can tell you that The last third-party audit we had over 900 images and over 100 different videos that we collected based on the selection of farms and procedures and interviews that the auditor want. And that was a 2.5 day of Zoom calls to conduct the audit. So it went very well. It was a great learning lesson. It's a lot more effort for everybody involved, involves a lot more sitting. So we are looking forward to having those in-person audits start now, certainly in the US where vaccines have rolled out, and globally, we're starting to see that. The interesting thing that I think has come out of this is that the supply chain at least has said, wow, virtual auditing is a great way for me to stay connected with my suppliers. So a lot of that I've talked to have said, we're going to continue to do virtual audits, maybe not with the video and the photos, but we're going to want to review those records and talk with our supply chain partners on a more regular basis. And we're still going to send our auditors out in person to be able to do those in-person observations. Some of the use of cameras, we're seeing more and more of that with remote auditing, where you can actually watch a remote feed as an auditor. And so I think that technology will continue as well, because if an auditor can sit and evaluate something very objectively without having to travel and get on an airplane, that could be good from a sustainability standpoint as well as from an efficiency standpoint.
That's interesting. Like how there's also some positive outcomes from a pandemic. Another question that came in was, how can people who are trained in animal welfare science and have an interest in broiler chickens get connected with the industry and possibly get careers in the industry?
Hey, great question. At least pre-COVID, I had a great love for talking with students. So I would say if you were a university, and particularly if you were teaching students, whether it's undergraduate, veterinary, or graduate students, please invite us in. A lot of us really welcome the opportunity to talk with students to talk about our careers and how we have gotten involved. My job is global. And so at least pre-COVID and hopefully after vaccines roll out around the world, I'll be getting on planes and going to see chickens in many, many different countries around the world and to help with welfare programs and welfare auditing. So I see that future growing. When I started in this role about 10 years ago, it was not common to have a director of animal welfare. More and more companies, both production companies as well as the food supply companies, have an entire team of dedicated animal welfare personnel. So if you're a student and you're listening to this talk and that's something you're passionate about, I think the job future is honestly really bright. As far as from a research perspective, both from professors as well as for students, I think getting connected with industry is really key moving forward. There's a lot of research that's being done internally on broiler farms, in hatcheries, in processing plants, that's being carried out by the specific production company or perhaps in collaboration with their partners. The challenge that we find in our role, and I speak for myself and for many others, is the challenge with, we do the research, but then we want to share it with others. And so we don't always have the time and the ability to actually publish that material. We might present it at scientific conferences, but really getting that material out in a scientific manner in a peer-reviewed journal, I think is the way forward. And I think that's where universities can really partner with production companies to help provide that resource and be involved from a critical thinking standpoint and an academic standpoint moving forward. But I think there's also an opportunity for researchers, in addition to doing pen trials, like Dr. Toscano talked about with layers and is commonly done with broilers, we honestly need to test a lot of that same technology in a commercial chicken house, whether it's a broiler house or breeder house, because having 50 birds in a pen is not the same as having 35,000 broilers in a house that's operated from day 1 to say day 50. So we need to make sure that those partnerships exist. A lot of broiler companies welcome the opportunity to have researchers come in and test their new technology. So robotics, lighting, density studies, enrichments, a lot of that we're testing internally, and we're partnering with some really interesting engineers and welfare scientists to try to better understand that.
Yes, thank you. I think we have time for one more question from Allison. You mentioned that one of the benefits of implementing technology would give producers more opportunities to observe behavior. What types of behavioral observations do you think would be most valuable for producers?
Allison, thank you for that question. I sometimes get questions from senior leadership and they say, what's normal behavior? Is normal behavior the same for a broiler? Is it the same for a rooster? Is it the same for a pullet? And I, from my perspective and my experience, I will tell you, no, the behaviors are quite different. And so a lot of times when I'm talking with our caretakers and our farmers, our employees, I'll say, take your 5-gallon bucket and go sit in the house and watch the birds. See what they're doing at the different ages. And so we include that in our training. So there are different behaviors that we look at, whether they are chicks that are a few weeks old, whether they are broilers, whether they are pullets, whether they're like breeders that you see in the background picture. There are different behaviors that we look at depending on the type of housing and depending on the type of bird. There's some behaviors that we want to see. For example, in a breeder house, we definitely want to see interaction of the roosters with the hens. We want to see mating. We want to see dust bathing. We want to see birds easily moving up and down from the slatted area and into and out of the nest. We don't want to see feather picking. We don't want to see cannibalism. We don't want to see nest or see floor eggs and broody hens. So there's some types of behaviors that are normal, but we want to avoid. And I think that was highlighted in the first talk as well. So I think camera technology, looking at what behaviors are happening, and also understanding the distribution of the birds in the house is really the future. We're not looking necessarily at the individual bird, but we're more looking at the group dynamics, that social hierarchy and that social movement of those birds within that space to see if there's a problem, if birds are avoiding, for example, a wall where we might have airflow challenges, or if they're on one water line and they're not in another, then that may tell us we've got an operational problem there. So I think the behavior and the distribution is really what I'd like to focus on. And I think that's really the focus of industry and technology that's being developed now.
Thank you very much for the answers and for your excellent talk. And now we'll move